So today our speaker is Dr. Jana Bacevic. She's a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Cambridge. So welcome, Jana. Your presentation is on universities, neoliberalism, and critique. And the floor is yours.
All right. Hello, everyone. Catch-22 refers to, in Joseph Heller's 1961 novel and later film of the same name, Catch-22 refers to a paradoxical situation that American soldiers in World War II faced. Namely, on being sent on flying missions, they obviously risk getting killed. In case they wanted to get away from that sort of risk, the easiest thing to do was to feign insanity, so to come across as if they were not actually fit to fly, in which case they stood a chance of being grounded and thus spared the chance of getting killed. However, were they to report into a medical examination unit claiming that they felt that they were losing their minds and thus that they're unfit to fly, paradoxically, this would mean that they would be interpreted as being completely sane because they're aware of the dangers that or the risk that they're running by flying, and thus they would be declared fit to fly, and thus obviously they'll be more likely to get killed. From this particular context, the concept of Catch-22 has expanded to refer to any sort of paradoxical situation, in particular, a paradoxical situation in which what Albert Hirschman referred to as the triad of exit, voice, and loyalty becomes collapsed either into a dyad in which voice becomes automatically, or rather is prohibited from leading to exit and becomes automatically identified with loyalty, or even worse, gets completely conflated, so there's no exit, there's only loyalty. So there's only remaining within a particular cycle of reproduction. More formally, this means, or Catch-22 refers to the situations in which, paradoxically, the possibility of acting in a way to avoid constraint in and of itself starts representing a constraint. So I would just like to ask you to keep this particular interpretation in mind as we go along. From the battlefields of, even if imaginary battlefields of World War II, we move on to a very different terrain, or a different war, something described increasingly as the war of universities, referring to the conflict or increasing encroachment of different forces usually associated with neoliberalism on universities globally, but also more specifically, especially in its rendering as a culture war in the UK over the past couple of years. All of these are snippets and titles from, on the one hand, newspapers and websites, and then on the other hand, so in addition to a war on universities, we're increasingly talking about the death of the university, especially the death of the public university. The killing of thinking, so universities in essence in some sort of grave danger. Now, whereas this particular framing or this particular form of critique has taken a particular bent in the past, say, couple of years, especially following, in the context of the UK, especially following the Brexit referendum, the concept or the critique itself is not so new. This is what it looks like in essence. So neoliberalism, as I said, is both an ideology and a set of policies, is interpreted with some sort of onslaught on the university or the concept of public university, leading to its presumably premature death. This particular conflict is played out through a series of binary oppositions between, for instance, the public and the private. The university is being subsidized by government versus the university run by market forces. The idea of university serving the public good versus the university being mostly, or higher education being mostly for private gain, and so on and so forth. Now, what interested me in this particular framing is not so much the opposition between these factors as the fact that in and of itself, the framing is not particularly new. So I spent about 14 years studying higher education, some of that in actual situations of violent conflict. And the one thing that permeated all of these discussions or all interpretations about what's going on in universities is this form of critique. Now, you know how academics are. If you put two academics, even in the same field, subfield, discipline in the same room, it's going to take them about 2 minutes to get to a point of disagreement. We tend to quibble over a footnote. So the first thing that got me very interested is that there's an overarching convergence on this form of critique. Almost everyone who is at universities today seems to agree that there is really something wrong with higher education today, and that roughly it can be interpreted in these terms. So that was the first thing that got me interested. In relation to this, the other thing that I became very interested in was the fact that despite overarching convergence concerning the interpretation or diagnosis of the war in universities, there was remarkably little by way of resistance. Now, of course, resistance is a relatively stretchy term, and of course there have been student protests, there has been some sort of organization by precarious staff, but by and large, neoliberalism has been allowed to proceed almost unopposed for the past 20 years. And that's another thing that I've actually became very interested in, which is how does neoliberalism as a concept work? So what sort of labor does it perform as an framework for what's going on in higher education? Especially given that, as I mentioned, it's not a particularly new form of interpretation, right? So what can explain, on the one hand, the fact that there is a remarkable convergence about the causes of this problem, and then on the other hand, the relative absence of at least sustained and effective opposition to it among academic staff. In other words, or sort of more broader framing, this led me to a few ways of looking at this particular problem. On the one hand, we have the sociology of knowledge, or the sort of social framing or social grounding of interpretative frameworks. In particular, I became interested in sociology of critique. Sociology of critique is a particular approach to sociology developed mostly by Luc Boltanski and then some of his collaborators that deals with how claims in the social realm are made, put forward, and thus how political contestation is pursued through the formulation of these claims in the public sphere. So my first question was obviously, well, there seems to be a convergence around this particular form of critique of neoliberalism in universities. Where does this come from? So why is this the case? The other thing, which was more specifically associated with neoliberalism, and that particularly interested me as a social theorist or someone who is interested in the social life of concepts, and particularly concepts in the wild, was what happens given that neoliberalism is, interestingly enough, equally the context, the concept, rather the object of critique, and something that is in and of itself developed as a form of critique. I will unpack these claims in a bit more detail later. But it might help to think about the fact there are very few hyper-objects that have the same status as neoliberalism in this particular sense, which means that whilst we are critiquing neoliberalism, we are at one and the same time part of the problem that we're trying to describe. So what I became particularly interested in here was how can we actually think about processes that it seems impossible to exit. So given how pervasive neoliberalism is, or given how pervasive the critique of neoliberalism claims neoliberalism is, how can one adopt a subject position that can actually comprehend this particular object? And this is why I refer to it, following Timothy Morton, as a hyper-object. And what does the capacity to do so, or the impossibility to do so, mean, not only for critique, but also more importantly, and this is where I move away from the sociological or social theoretical into a more political framing, for the possibility to constitute a form of political actorhood that could actually lead towards effective resistance. What do I mean by this? We normally assume that there is a relationship between the way, or at least sociology of critique assumes that there is a relationship between the way that we frame claims in the public sphere and their combination of diagnostic and normative, so what's going on, plus is this a good or a bad thing, and why, and how we can actually act in the public domain. This is something that, in particular, well, particularly in relation to neoliberalism, has, among others, been explored by Wendy Brown and Judith Butler in their recent books on doing the demos and notes towards a performative theory of assembly. So what does neoliberalism in higher education mean for the way in which we can or cannot constitute a meaningful form of political subjectivity that can act against or despite these trends? Now, all of this leads me to the next element that's quite relevant in the context of the sociology of critiques, which is, in essence, what does critique do? Now, the theory of performativity, or the theory of the performativity of speech acts, as was developed initially by Austin and then substantially revised by Searle, basically says that what we say has an effect on reality. This is a relatively uncontentious claim, but then it has been extended in a particularly interesting, in the context of neoliberalism domain, which says that one of the reasons why higher education is being transformed is because there are claims formulated with a specific subdomain. That domain is usually known as neoclassical economics, that tend to frame certain objects, certain elements, certain practices, including education and universities and those who work within them, as something. So, for instance, as a private asset, as something that should be contributing to economic growth, and so on and so forth. Now, the interesting thing for me is the following. If we say economic discourses are performative, we are saying that discourses are performative. This is the essence of the theory of performativity. But by the same vein, or in the same vein, critique should also be performative. So critique is also a form of speech act, so it should also have effects. So my question was thus then, well, given performativity of economics, so if we accept the discourses that aim to reframe or reformulate or enact higher education and knowledge as economic assets, or something that can be a private good, so something that can be a commodity. What does this mean for claims, for critical claims, or for claims that aim to frame education as something other than this? So what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes or so, possibly less, is to talk a bit about how some of the dominant framings within the critique of higher education and research look at the way in which political actorhood is framed. Marxist critique, and obviously I've mentioned this on a few other occasions. I mean, all forms of critique tend to be somewhat, they're very broad. So in that sense, this is going to be necessarily a bit of a reductive framing, but I think that there is a way to establish minimal common denominators in most critical strands, so this is what I will be focusing on. In the context of Marxist critique, what we know is that in universities as well as outside of them, what is the source of value is labor, and this labor is somehow being exploited or being expropriated from those who are laboring, in this particular case academics, and then used to generate profit, and increasingly via privatization of education, higher education, used to generate profit for profit companies, corporations, and so on and so forth. In this particular case, it's not so much the ownership of one's labor that becomes the problem, but the identity of a laborer in and of itself. So precarity is framed as increasingly the most contentious issue within the domain of higher education, so the insecurity of academic employment and limitations to political agency predicated on this. The problem with this is that capacity to labor is actually, in the context of critique, framed as the desirable end goal, despite the fact that there is insistence on the idea that working conditions should be more conducive to a particular form of academic laboring. So, for instance, one that allows more space for creativity, one that respects the concept of academic freedom, one that's appreciative of different forms or ways in which people can go about performing their labor and so on and so forth. But the problem is that it cannot actually conceive of a non-laboring subject. So in other words, the problem with precarity is exactly the absence of security of employment. Moving on from here, what I broadly term the post-structuralist critique, mostly inspired by Foucault's, or in most cases reliant on Foucault's views, emphasizes the intensification of labor, or especially of academic labor, in the context of late capitalism. So, but what becomes the problem here is that somehow the laboring subjects they morph into a single laboring subject. The source of political power is increasingly moved from the university, so it becomes on the outside. So what political power does in this particular context is that it ensures that those who are laboring within the universities will constantly be pushed to compete against each other, and that institutions will also be pushed to compete against each other. The way to ensure this, or there are two ways that this can be ensured. One is by metricization, so by reducing all labor outputs to the same standard, a measured standard, for instance, research output. And on the other hand, by constant audit and surveillance. So, and these two obviously rely on each other. So what we get here is that university has become almost completely privatized. Those who are working within it are all reduced to some sort of, to a source of value. But this value is, well, first of all, reduced to the same standard, then constantly measured and re-evaluated, and is also under constant threat of being actually finally sold, so sold in the marketplace. What happens in this particular case is that the only way that it's possible to conceive of resistance is by rendering oneself invisible. So if surveillance is the problem, then lack of transparency is the answer. What's really interesting here is that we actually witness a sort of a double movement between privatization, or the public, and then private again. So on the one hand, universities and academic labor are privatized, but then on the other hand, their outputs are rendered ever so more public, in the sense in which rankings are, for instance, publicized. Research output is publicized. So, for instance, the research excellence framework is something that is intended to make visible, transparent, and legible the outputs or the outcomes of academic labor to everyone. So in this sense, the political subject, the object of surveillance, becomes ever more amorphous, because that's the only way in which we can conceive resistance to this type of domination. Now, the third iteration is where the source of power, which in the previous one is perhaps invisible, so there's someone at the other end of this camera. There's presumably someone watching, but as Foucault famously framed it, perhaps not. There is no need for anyone to be watching, but we still assume someone might be watching. This source of political power has become completely obliterated in a form of critique that I referred to as new materialist critique, because now academics are completely ruled by algorithms. So we don't even have there is no necessity anymore for any sort of direct form of control, because with rankings, with metricization, and with the full digitalization of all of these techniques for measuring comparison and surveillance, the lived space of the university is so imbricated, or becomes so imbricated by these technologies, that there is virtually no escaping anymore. The system runs on its own. So there is virtually no one needed any longer to even push the button, right? So the problem with this particular framing, however, is that it further amalgamizes the political subject who could be the source of resistance, because the only shared point at this particular point in time is the fact that since algorithms and big data are framed as somehow inhuman, the only shared point for resistance is humanity itself. So the only thing that everyone who could claim to resist this has in common is that they're human. But differences between those who work in universities, and in particular differences among their capacity to make political claims, are further obliterated. So now I'd like to move to what I think this means for the capacity or the possibility of the constitution of a political subject. So what we have here in principle is the sort of the old playing between us and them. So us on the one hand are those who are somehow impacted by these changes. Them is everyone who's somehow generating these changes. But us has become increasingly homogeneous, at least to the degree to which we are capable of making claims. So claims in the context of contestation in the war of universities have become increasingly homogeneous. If you can think about, what are the claims today, it's mostly about reverting to an older version of what life in universities used to be like. So relatively secure employment, longer-term contracts, freedom to research, recognition of the value of teaching, and so on and so forth. So that's more or less it. The way in which the heterogeneity of the academic workforce and everyone who works in universities beyond them, which is not exhausted in the context of, or by the concept of the academic workforce, is only through the virtue of recognition. So we can recognize that people are somehow different, but this source of difference is primarily identity-based. So, for instance, we can recognize that people have different ethnicities, different sexualities, different nationalities, and so on and so forth. But we assume that, by and large, everyone tends towards the same requirements as far as redistribution is concerned. Now, on the other hand, them, so those that we are supposedly mobilizing against or aiming to mobilize against, becomes an ever-shifting target. So on the one hand, we have managers who are obviously the problem. On the other hand, we have vice-chancellors whose salaries are the problem. Then we also have the government, but then we're not really sure who in the government we actually should blame for what's going on. And then finally, we also have these increasingly non-human forms of or sources of domination. So for instance, algorithms, rankings, research assessment exercises. And sometimes we even frame those who implement them, or we treat them almost as if they were not human. So for instance, we treat consultants as almost sort of human algorithms, so someone who only implements or reflects a particular program that's contained in a non-human form. So they just exercise something. They have no agency of their own. So what happens here is that the source of what we should mobilize again becomes this ever-receding center of political power. So we no longer know who is it that we need to fight against, right? There is not a particular enemy. There is no particular source of power. Now, some would obviously, Foucault among them, say that this is all right because this is actually what neoliberalism is. Neoliberalism is about capillary power, so power increasingly being withdrawn from a particular center, a particular institution, a particular idea, and thus seeping into all possible spheres of society. Now, I want to contrast this with Boltanski's critique of sociologies of domination. And one important thing that Boltanski says is that despite the obvious attractiveness of the idea of domination, especially from a perspective in which it does seem as if domination is really everywhere and there is no exit, one of the problems is that if we assume that something is everywhere, it becomes very difficult to somehow conceptualize it. So Boltanski says, well, the problem with theories of domination, and he's primarily talking about Bourdieu's sociology, is that theories of domination assume that those who are dominated do not know what's going on. In the context of in the context of higher education, this is very interesting because people who are dominated are at the same time the people whose job it is to know what's going on. Those who are engaged in the critique of higher education or in the critique of the transformation of higher education are at the same time researching higher education. So it's very difficult in this particular case to claim that we are really unaware of how domination works because what we write, what we publish, what we do is the interpretation of how domination works. So how come there hasn't been a better connection between these two? And here I want to go back to something else that Boltanski says in the sociology in critique about sociology of emancipation, which is that in order for action to be possible, there has to be a backdrop of uncertainty. So there needs to be a plurality of possible options. So one particular way in which we can look at critique or understand critique is, first of all, a heuristic, so a form of understanding what goes on, and second of all, a technology of recovering agency. And this is what I want to turn to now, which is how do these two elements match? So how does what we know about the transformation of higher education and research from a critical perspective, any of these critical perspectives, match what we can, for want of a better term, do about it? Now, critique, especially in the context of neoliberalism, aims to know power as something that's manifested either through discourse or through its effects. The emphasis on manifestation of power through discourse actually obviously comes through Foucault, and then in the context of higher education is particularly or often exercised through the analysis of policies. So policies are text. We read texts in order to understand what this governing rationality, as Foucault has referred to it, means. So in order to know what power wants, we read texts. So we read words. We assume that there is a link between words and action. The other way in which we know power is obviously by its felt effects. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of critique of neoliberalism in higher education and research deals with effective consequences of the transformation itself. So we know what goes on because on the one hand, we feel it, and this is how we reinterpret, emphasize our common humanity by feeling. And then on the other hand, through reading. So actually trying to figure out what is it that this particular form of power wants to happen. And this has been the way in which the critique of neoliberalism on the whole has pursued, at least throughout most of its history. It has emphasized the confluence of neoliberalism, or neoliberalism as a combination of ideology and forms of representation. So neoliberalism is, in this particular interpretation, a predominantly, or initially at least, an intellectual project. So all of these authors talk about the sort of governing rationality. So the idea is to recover or uncover, reconstruct what were the ideas behind neoliberal transformation, and then these ideas somehow lead to particular forms of political agency. So in that sense, what critique does is that it mimics this particular movement. It says there is a link between speech as text and agency. So there is a link between neoliberal texts and what happens at universities. So we are more or less going to do the same thing. We're going to produce texts, we're going to produce speech, and by producing speech, we're going to assume that somehow effects are instantiated. So critique of neoliberalism in higher education predominantly takes the form of the contestation of ontology. So we talk about how things really are. We're saying, no, you got it wrong. Education is not a commodity. Education is actually a public good. Now, as a particular form of speech, this is a contestation of ontology. So this is saying, no, we actually have better access to what education is. But what happens is that assuming the link between the two means, or at least in my interpretation, means that we assume that by reiterating knowledge about higher education, we're somehow going to instantiate effects. So by saying over and over again, in different forms, no, university is not for sale, no, students are not customers, we're really going to turn students, or we're going to make sure that students do not become customers and the university is not really sold, so to speak. So what I want to ask, or what I fundamentally want to query is, does this really work? And what I want to argue is that not only that it doesn't, but that the assumption that it will work is one of the things that keep tripping critique up. And this is, I created this particular meme at, I think, a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that really fascinated me about the discussion that ensued about it on social media was that everyone found it funny. And I didn't to the degree to which it's only interesting that lecture capture software repeats or mimics Foucault's critique of the panopticon if we think that there is still if we still think there is something intransparent about sources of power, including sources of power in higher education. One of the reasons why it's absolutely possible for something which is effectively a monitoring device to be called panopto, so basically to have its nature instantiated in its name, is in part because the unmasking nature of critique, what Latour criticized as the iconoclastic tendency, no longer performs any sort of role if it ever did. So in that sense, I want to move to, well, the question of what does this mean? Is there something we can do about this? Does this mean, as Latour claimed, that critique has run out of steam? Should we? And he also revised that, so he doesn't sit with that any longer. Does this mean we should just give up? Does this mean that neoliberalism is truly everywhere and, should we just capitulate? Or have we capitulated already? Does critique have any role to play? And this is where I want to emphasize something I think stems pretty directly from this assumption that, to speak, is at the same time to act, and the relationship between knowledge claims and forms of political agency. It's very easy to assume that the fact that there is, to put it mildly, some sort of limitation on agency or resistance within higher education, that means neoliberalism is truly everywhere and is truly omnipotent. Another way of framing it would be to say, well, what if we're inclined to think that neoliberalism is truly everywhere and is truly omnipotent because we're powerless to act? So it becomes convenient, to put it mildly, to interpret something which is an overarching social phenomenon from the perspective from which we're viewing it as if it really has no end. This, in other words, constitutes something that quite a few people have criticized as the epistemic fallacy, which is that the way we know things is equivalent and coextensive with the way things really are. Now, I don't want to claim that this means that, so my angle on this is not saying, well, there are spaces beyond, there are spaces that are not entirely covered by neoliberalism, there are pockets of resistance, there are islands, there are bubbles, and so on and so forth. That has been a relatively powerful critique. I think it has its merits, but it's not one that I want to pursue for a whole host of reasons. What I want to pursue instead is the idea that it's actually possible to be living with paradoxes, including living in the so-called neoliberal university, and rather than, moreover, that we might have to live with paradoxes. So we might have to accept, or we might want to start from the assumption that it's actually possible to be living in the context of neoliberalism whilst being critical of it. That, however, being critical of it does not necessarily, at least in and of itself, constitute somehow effective resistance to neoliberalism. Critique in this sense, or that perhaps, on the other hand, it's possible for critique to function both as an effect or consequence or element of neoliberalism and as something that aims to be outside of it. There's a logical form of this. It's called the Russell paradox. It's a set that's at the same time a member of itself and not a member of itself. I won't bore you with the specifics of what this concretely means, but let's just say that from my point of view, this refers to what spaces of political agency are opened through the fact that as we are engaged in the critique of neoliberalism, we also live within neoliberalism, and there is no way for us not to reproduce exactly the forms of governmentality that neoliberalism is about. So, for instance, I presume you're not using Panopto here, for lecture capture. Well, so this particular talk is being live streamed and recorded, right? So on the one hand, it constitutes something that I think a lot of critics of the transformation of universities would frame as an element of audit culture. So you can always be seen, you can always be watched. There is always someone on the other side. But then at the same time, I'm able and capable of engaging in the critique of that very process as I'm doing it. You are capable of participating, and I hope reacting to this critique as you're engaged in the process of reproducing it and enacting it. So these are the types of paradoxes that I think we have to start working through rather than aiming to somehow break them apart, which is something that Latour identified as the tendency for purification by the moderns. So, so higher education can either be a commodity or it can be outside of the sphere of commodity exchange. Something is either a public good or it's completely private. This is not an argument for public-private partnerships, just make that very clear. And so on and so forth. So we're either being critical or otherwise we have bought wholesale into neoliberal ideology and so on and so forth. I think that this tendency to purify things, so to aim to establish a relatively fixed, unitary ontological and not only ontological value for objects is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to carve out a space for critique in contemporary universities, in part because critique in and of itself has developed, obviously as part and an integral element of modernity, has developed as a form, a technique of purification, of saying, no, this is not this is something else. So with all this in mind, I actually want to ask and possibly only start by giving an answer to the question of what are the prerequisites for actually acting together. So if we assume that agency is not only effectuated nor exhausted through speech. So if we assume that we need to move beyond speech acts, if we assume that we need to move beyond critique as saying something and being a form of knowledge claim, saying, no, we know that university is this, or we know that this is what higher education is really about, or we know that competitive or say research evaluation does not contribute to good scholarship and so on and so forth. What is it that we can actually do? So what is it that we should be doing as well? And I want to build on Judith Butler's work, to think about what acting together actually means, and what acting together means not only in the context of the university, but also in the context in which the university is embedded in broader social structures. And I think it might help to think about the university as a form of community. And when I say community, I don't, there's often, especially in critique of neoliberalism, that there's a bit of sort of communitarian nostalgia. So communities seem to be something that's somehow, homogeneous, nicely fitting together and so on and so forth. I think the advantages of communities are that they're patchworky, they're very heterogeneous, they're often fraught with conflicts and internal contradiction. And so is the university, and so is the university increasingly in the context of both diversification and massification of higher education. So in that sense, thinking about what constitutes boundaries of the university. So who belongs? Because in order to constitute a political subject, for better or worse, we need to have at least an idea of who we is. And I think it's one of the things that the critique of neoliberalism in higher education has not dealt with at all, or at least has not dealt with very well. So we don't actually know who is the we. The recent discussions around the forthcoming UCU strike, for instance, have, from my point of view, pointed this out very vividly, because precarious and early career researchers have started saying, well, we're not sure that we can afford to strike because we can't afford to lose that amount of income, and obviously there are issues behind it that are never in the open, including whether this constitutes risk in terms of chances for future employment and so on and so forth. And I think, sort of personal issues aside, I think that this is something that needs to be thought through, because if not, so if we don't think about the differences within the university, if we do not acknowledge the fact that different people, different groups within the university might have, if not fundamentally, but then substantially different worldviews, needs, ideas about things, I think we won't be able to think about the constitution of a university or the constitution of political subjectivity within a university, and thus also, by definition, our thinking about ways of resisting neoliberalism will remain limited and also fraught, because it will be it will remain sensitive and vulnerable to any sort of external challenge. So, what I want to say is that, by way of ending, I mentioned hyperobjects at the beginning, and this is where I come back to them. Timothy Morton describes hyperobjects as something, or he uses the metaphor of an iceberg. So we only ever see the top floating, and icebergs are usually, there's more under the surface, as it were, than meets the eye. And I think neoliberalism is a hyperobject first, and is very much akin to an iceberg, in the sense in which, especially as academics in the neoliberal university, we're very much like this poor polar bear here. So we're floating on top of a rapidly melting iceberg, and the only thing we're actually capable of noticing, the only thing we're capable of thinking about is our own position on it. This is normal. This is not, I mean, it's not anything to be, I think it's very difficult to avoid this. I don't think it's even desirable to avoid it. So this is not the concept of, subject position that I think we need to particularly work against. I think what we need to work with is realizing that our own subject position often does not exhaust the entirety of the phenomenon we're trying to deal with. And I think that this is one of the main challenges in the neoliberal university, as it were. So I have more polar bears. So this is what I think could work as a similar or parallel metaphor image for the constitution of political subjectivity, which is, I mean, this is at the same time a symbol, as a injunction, as a verb, but also an assemblage as both a theoretical or analytical construct and as, I think, a formulation for what's going on here. So this is a pack of, or a family perhaps, of polar bears, and which the reason why I like this image, in addition to the fact that I like polar bear images overall, is, they're clearly of different sizes and thus obviously different age, so they're not equally strong. And it makes sense to assume that they have different needs, but they do work together as an assemblage, so as a form of unitary political act, despite the fact that this might entail recognition of the fact that they do not have exactly the same needs. So, on that note, I thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thanks, Jana. So, just a reminder that please help yourself to refreshments if you feel so. Otherwise, the floor is now open for questions and discussion. Just a reminder that people who are following online can also email questions to address seminars@lancaster.ac.uk. Okay, the floor is now open. Anybody want to take the floor? Sorry, go ahead.
Thanks, that was really interesting. I don't know, you might not necessarily have an answer. I'm not expecting like a solution. But the one thing that I was thinking throughout, especially when you were talking about like possibilities of maybe not even resistance, but just kind of collective action, is the role that publishing houses play. Because obviously one of the big problems is the kind of disparity between readership and price. The fact that like journal subscriptions are massively inflated and this kind of thing. And obviously it's a kind of strange position because there are things that are outside of the university but are deeply associated with them. So I was just wondering if something like your suggestion for collective action, what the possibilities are for addressing things like these kinds of labour that we have to engage in, but we don't have so much say in.
Thank you for. Shall I? Okay. So thank you for that. I think that's a very interesting question, because I do think that the case of academic publishing is one of the good examples of where this sort of paradox that I was talking about actually comes to the fore. So we're faced with presumably as an academic you need to publish, and as an academic you presumably want to get your work, so your words, out to as many people as possible. But in order to do that, you are almost inevitably reliant on the publishing industry, which is a sort of, and the associated political economy, which by and large, and this is something that I've written about with a colleague it's very difficult, even in the cases of open access, etc., to avoid, so to kind of to stand aside from the neoliberal nature, as it were, of this particular political economy for a whole host of reasons. I mean, this is a disputed claim, but what we claimed is that inevitably, even if we go for the most open of ways of getting your message across, you almost inadvertently end up to a degree reproducing exactly the modes of exactly the modes that you're aiming to criticize. So my question was more, I mean, I'm on the one hand, I'm a bit split about this, which I think is normal given the topic. On the one hand, I would like to think that it would be possible to wholesale, even if step by step or incrementally move away from the way in which academic or publishing industry, well, academia and publishing industries are intertwined. But then again, I think this still rests on the assumption that we just need to get our message across, right? It rests on this assumption of inequality between our own understanding of things and presumably the lack of understanding of, people out there. Because my question is fundamentally, so who is it that we're aiming to communicate this message to? So who is it that cannot access academic publications? So, I mean, research shows that, most people who read academic publications are other academics. So this isn't really about inequalities in access for the wider population. This is about the assumption that everyone should want to read what we have to say. And I think that this is still predicated on the idea that our words are powerful, and it's only for the lack of awareness of the true nature of domination that there is no resistance. And I think this is not the case. I think that we seriously need to take into account that, well, to put it mildly, this may be not all there is to it, right? So I don't think it's about the lack of understanding. I don't think we need to write more and publish more. In effect, I do think it would be very nice if we started publishing less and possibly writing less as well.
I'm put in mind of ice picks and the Russian Revolution. You started with saying, within 2 seconds academics can start arguing against each other, which is perfectly true. And then we've got a very optimistic picture of the end and the Russian Revolution and everything that happened there. Also thinking about South Africa and the road, what started as the road must fall, with a very clear symbol, which ended up with a bucket of feces over it and quickly got moved. But then the changing nature of that to fees must fall and so on, to the arguments and who the leaders were and everything just became anarchy. So much so that just became impossible to deal with or to move anywhere. And so I'm wondering whether, think about Chile, which went incredibly neoliberal, and then it all fell apart quite stupidly, and the government had to take action. I just wonder whether, actually, we wouldn't get that. We'd get a road must fall, peace must fall, transformation, changing a set of agendas. Actually, it needs government intervention, it needs political change, rather than us, because us will make a mess of it, probably.
Well, I think that probably, it runs in the direction of the argument that since academics are clearly unfit to govern themselves, then they must be governed. And I like to think that it's not the case. I think that, well, much like the latter day and contemporary interpretations of the Russian Revolution, there is inherent danger in judging or evaluating the worth or success of a particular political movement by the way it ended or by what it turned into. So I do not think that the fact that different struggles within the university and concerning the nature of the university, the fact that they can move in a lot of different directions is not a reason to doubt or to be preemptively suspicious about their value. I would always rather see and I think that roads must fall, and then also sort of moving back to this part of the world, the whole decolonizing the curriculum agenda, are actually a very interesting case, because they can really go either way. So they can liberate the university from its clearly harmful colonial legacy, but they can do that in a way that fundamentally challenges exactly the power structures on which the whole concept of, Western modernity, enlightenment, and the institution itself is founded. Or they can do that in a way that changes the content of those assumptions whilst leaving the institution itself intact. And I have a political preference in that sense. It would obviously always go in the direction of disrupting the institution itself, even if that means that it might descend into what you refer to as anarchy. So I think that in this sense, but that's a political preference, clearly, not an analytical one. So I think that there is something to be said about the degree to which we can actually question things before they stop being what we are questioning itself. So there is obviously a question of, and this is something I was discussing just yesterday with Guminda Bamber, who was giving a talk at Cambridge, which is, given the way in which, say, the university is predicated on the legacy of colonial exploitation and the whole idea of Western or rationality, modernity as a Western project, can we actually discuss, can we question that without dismantling the institution itself? And, going back to our academics fit to govern themselves, I think my answer would always be, if we are not, then we actually deserve to be governed, in a manner of speaking. So I would like to think that there is a way within the university to self-organize, and this is exactly why, the assemblage is there. It need not go, and this is what theorists or assemblage theorists have said over and over again, its agency need not always go in the same direction. So in that sense, the whole is actually less than the sum of its parts, in the sense in which the identity and agency of its parts is never exhausted completely by the whole. So in that sense, I would be very happy to see the university as, in a manner of speaking, an assemblage. So as an institution that can still, to some degree, put together or bring together different interests of different political groups and actors, despite the fact that they need not agree on a whole lot of things. I think the university is anyway going in that direction, but with a very neoliberal bent. So I think that what ideally we should aim for is to repurpose that in the direction that's not neoliberal. But I fully agree with you that it's an open question whether this is actually feasible. But choosing between never knowing and finding out, even if results are not necessarily exactly what we're hoping they would be, I'm always in favor of finding out. But again, that's also, I guess, a political preference. So.
I have two questions, maybe building on the previous one. So one about making increasingly public our articles and products, as well as the research data itself. And you refer to this as a sort of a counter-movement to increase the metricized surveillance of academics. So I'm just wondering, why could you do this so straightforwardly? In a way, couldn't we look at increasing public nature as another form of value, or another form, especially data from research? as just another forms of producing value over and over again, and then it becomes sort of like exploitation again in a way. And then the second question, building on Paul, I was quite intrigued by this idea of yours about reworking the boundaries of the university as a community. However, still I'm wondering about how you relate this to structures and power relations, and also building boundaries in time of peace versus turbulence, or abundance versus scarcity, and what happens, because I'm not really convinced that standing together activism in the sense that senior academics would also fight for junior academics or precarious academics is enough in a way.
Okay, thank you. Those are very good questions. The first one is particularly welcome because I was fully aware that I did not expand on that at all, and the reason I didn't is because it's part of my work, but completely, I wouldn't say completely unrelated. Clearly, it's all related, but stands a bit aside from what I wanted to focus on. So yes, I fully agree. I mean, this one thing is kind of more of a double or even triple movement in the manner of speaking for build from Polanyi. So in one sense, rendering research data public means that it becomes open and becomes transparent, but clearly this movement has been inspired, if not directly implemented, by the overarching drive for privatization. So the drive to convert knowledge into something which is a marketable good, so a commodity. And this is exactly where some of the contradictions and the challenges that I referred to in the answer to your question, I think, come from, because this capitalizes in a very smart way on what I think is the motivating force for individual academics. And again, this is where we actually see into your question, the second question, which is, individual academics whom, right? So does everyone equally, does this apply to everyone equally? So, but I think academics as a whole, this idea that we need to get our message across, we need to get it out there, we need to engage as many people as possible. So I think it does capitalize on that, but it capitalizes on that in ways that are clearly aimed or geared towards private gain or individualistic gain, so through metrics and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I think it's more of so this is what I was referring to, kind of it's privatized, rendered public, but public in the sense of transparency, and then re-privatized or then reframed as something that's also part of the valorization. I think that this extends to the concept of public good as a whole, because, on perhaps a slightly obvious note, a public good is also a good. So it does entail the possibility of being framed as a commodity or valued, and thus also measured, thus also exchanged, and so on and so forth. So, and I think that there is this particular conflation between the idea of, the sort of getting our message out there and the assumed benevolent reception, and as well as need for that message, as in, we need to make sure that everyone has access to academic knowledge, because presumably everyone is in need of more academic knowledge, and the way in which this can be used is probably one of the most interesting elements of the neoliberal transformation of higher education research on the whole. And I think it's driven, and this is why I focused on the underlying ontologies, I think it's driven by the assumption that, speech is at the same time a form of agency. So what we say, that even if, regardless of whether it's spoken or written, so words have effects. So if only more people read what we're actually saying, more people will understand them and more people will act. And I think that this particular link, well, as I said again, to put it mildly, would need to be questioned or challenged. The other thing about the possibility of acting together is something that, this is also why I left it open, this is why I've engaged with it, I guess, least of all, with the exception of quaint polar bear images, in part because I do think it's one of the most challenging aspects of it. And this goes back to the question of boundaries, which is who is in, who is out. Who belongs to the university. Why, when we talk about the university, we rarely ever talk about cleaners, but we talk about academics. So it's not only junior and senior staff. Again, even when we talk about academic workers, why is it that we assume that everyone, the concept of academic worker by nature tends towards the position of the tenured professor? I mean, that's also a very questionable assumption. It's one that stems directly from, or at least I claim stems directly from the Marxist assumption that the primary identity with which we need to reckon for the agent of political change is the worker. So, and in this sense, I'm very much in favor, for instance, the whole critique of work as necessity and so on and so forth. And that I'm very happy to also see there's been more of that, including in the context of higher education as of recently. So I am very, I'm agnostic as far as this is concerned. The reason why I brought it up is exactly because I think that it makes sense to assume that in order for something to happen, we need to act together. And this is one of the, I think, main findings of my research. We need to move beyond just speaking and into the idea that perhaps speech does not constitute an act, or the fact that there are speech acts is not sufficient for there to be agency, especially not longer-lasting political agency. But in order to act, we need to think about difference. And that's the most challenging thing. So I think we need to think about the way in which different people, different entities within within universities, but also outside of them, constitute this space of agency. And this is something I think is really underdeveloped in political theory on the whole. Judith Butler, for instance, really engages with it openly in the sense of thinking about, well, is it sufficient for a certain number of bodies to come into a specific space in order to act? So what was specific about Occupy? What was specific about the fact that Occupy made a difference, but then also, in a manner of speaking, phased out? How can we think about this in the context of universities? So how can we actually think about this in the context of an institution that was historically predicated on a difference? So on the idea that there are some of us in here who know something, and then there are people out there who presumably do not. And I think that thinking this difference and thinking differences within the university is a necessary element of any type of political agency. And this is, when I say thinking, this isn't just a sort of again, quaint, post-structuralist quirk, as in, we need to throw these things up in the air a bit and, shake them up. It's really trying to think through, whilst at the same time, floating on top of this iceberg. I just think that not engaging with them at all, or engaging with them in predefined categories, as I think we're now prone to doing, by, sort of an easy example is early career versus established academics is also a very binary distinction. I mean, what does early career mean? What does established mean? Not everyone is equally precarious, nor is, and this is, I think, one of the main points I was trying to make, nor is precarity the sole or exhaustive political category from within we constitute, or within which differences constitute, and from within which we need to think it. So I guess that's a very long way of not answering your question, but it's for a good reason, which is I do not have an answer to it. And I think that this has been my attempt to think through some of these these things, and I'm hoping to continue doing that. I'm hoping to continue doing that with other people. I just kind of think it should be out there. And I'll switch back to the nice polar bears, since I see you all got depressed by sort of limitations on action. So.
Before we close,